The first light of morning barely touched the Pacific when a lone officer stood in the cold basement beneath Pearl Harbor's old administration building. The air was still, heavy with the hum of fluorescent lamps, and in his hands lay a decoded message that felt less like paper and more like a verdict. It spoke of 4 Japanese carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and a coming blow that could erase what remained of the American Pacific Fleet. No alarm sounded above him. No engines roared. Yet in that quiet moment, the war balanced on the edge of a single interpretation. He had lived through one disaster already, the smoke of Pearl Harbor, the bodies pulled from the harbor waters, the names never given a second sunrise. All of it pressed against him as he read the coded lines again. If he was wrong now, thousands more would follow. But if he was right, history might turn. So the question lingered in that dim room, sharper than any weapon at sea. The smoke of Pearl Harbor had never really left him. Even months later, Joseph Rochefort could still recall the way it curled above Battleship Row, the bitter mix of burning oil and twisted steel settling into the air like a warning no one had deciphered in time. He had not known Seaman First Class James Anderson, one of the 1,177 men lost aboard the USS Arizona, but the young sailor's fate lived in the back of his mind. It became a quiet weight, the reminder of what failure in intelligence truly cost. Not miscalculated numbers, not missed signals, lives. So Rochefort built his refuge or his prison in the cold basement, beneath Pearl Harbor's administration building. That was where Station Hypo took shape, not as a gleaming intelligence center, but as a cramped, windowless labyrinth of concrete, wires, cots, and desks littered with pencils worn down to stubs. The room never warmed, the air never moved, but the work never stopped. 12-hour shifts turned into 20. Analysts slept where they sat, wrapped in blankets or jackets, while outside the Hawaiian sun blazed over a world that had no idea how fragile its safety was. The team itself was an unlikely orchestra. Mathematicians, linguists, radio operators, even musicians from the sunken USS California who, stripped of their instruments, found that reading code patterns wasn't so different from reading musical scores. Rhythm mattered, intuition mattered, seeing what didn't fit mattered. Rochefort, usually in his robe and slippers, moved among them like a conductor who knew every note of a symphony no one else could hear. Their enemy was JN-25, a Japanese naval code built from tens of thousands of number groups, each changed and disguised by random additive ciphers. At best, Station Hypo could read half of any intercepted message. The rest had to be reconstructed like a puzzle missing pieces that had never existed. But piece by piece, message by message, the outlines of Japan's ambitions emerged across the Pacific. And then came Coral Sea. Intelligence from Hypo had helped the U.S. Navy intercept the Japanese advance toward Port Moresby. The battle was a strategic victory but a bitter one. The carrier Lexington was lost. Over 200 men died. Rochefort understood the truth more deeply than ever. Accurate intelligence did not matter unless it saved lives before the killing began. By mid-May 1942, another pattern was forming. A coded designation, AF, kept appearing in Japanese traffic. It was associated with aircraft carriers, transport vessels, and discussions of water shortages. To Rochefort, the answer was unmistakable. AF was Midway, a scrap of coral halfway across the vast Pacific. Small yet vital. But Washington disagreed. Analysts insisted AF might be the Aleutians, or Port Moresby, or even the American West Coast. It became more than a disagreement. It became a bureaucratic war, one that might decide the real war. And while the arguments echoed between Honolulu and Washington, Rochefort felt the same dread he had known before Pearl Harbor. The Pacific had become a chessboard, and every intercepted message revealed another piece moving into place. To Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Japan's naval strategy, the plan was elegant. Strike the Aleutians to draw American attention north, then seize Midway and destroy what remained of the U.S. carrier force. When it rushed to defend the island, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soru, and Hiru, would form the spearhead, backed by battleships, cruisers, and thousands of trained aircrew. On paper, the balance was undeniable. Japan appeared unbeatable, but deep in the basement at Pearl Harbor, Station Hypo was dismantling that illusion line by line. Despite the doubts from Washington, Joseph Rochefort and his team were seeing a pattern too consistent to ignore. Carrier divisions were concentrating. Supply ships were loading for a major operation. And again, the target designation AF appeared among the coded fragments. Everything pointed to Midway. Yet, belief was not enough. Not for Admiral Ernest King, nor for the analysts in Washington who insisted AF must mean something else. The Aleutians, perhaps, or Port Moresby. Rochefort was not only fighting Japanese ciphers, he was fighting American bureaucracy, and bureaucracy rarely yielded to intuition, no matter how brilliant. The breakthrough came from Jasper Holmes, a quiet former submariner whose understanding of Pacific geography ran as deep as the ocean itself. If the Japanese spoke of water shortages at AF, then the Americans could force the answer into the open. Midway had no natural fresh water. If its desalination plant failed, and the message went out unencrypted, the Japanese would surely intercept it and mention AF in their response. It was a dangerous idea, almost audacious. Broadcasting an operational problem in the clear defied every rule of wartime security. But wars are not won by strict obedience, and Admiral Chester Nimitz understood that. When presented with the plan, he simply said, "Do it. Don't tell Washington." The message was sent. The island reported a broken distillation system, fresh water running low, repairs needed, and then station hypo waited. Hours passed. Silence. Then more silence. The tension in the basement was palpable, the kind that squeezes the breath from a room. Then, on May 22nd, an intercepted transmission arrived. Encrypted. Routine. The team began to work, and slowly the outline emerged from the cipher. AF reports fresh water shortage. There it was, the confirmation Washington demanded, the proof Rochefort already knew in his bones. AF was Midway, and now the Americans could fight on their own terms. Nimitz acted at once. He placed his 3 carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the battle-damaged Yorktown at a hidden position northeast of Midway, a point his staff optimistically called Point Luck. Repair crews worked around the clock to restore Yorktown in 72 hours, a miracle of American industry compressed into desperation. Across the ocean, Japan sailed into the trap believing it held every advantage. But the Americans had something far more powerful than surprise. They had knowledge. Dawn broke over the Pacific on June 4, 1942, but the sky above Midway was already trembling with engines. At 5:34 a.m., a patrol plane sighted the approaching Japanese strike force exactly where Station Hippo had predicted. The first wave of Midway's aircraft launched almost immediately. Marine fighters, army bombers, and torpedo planes climbing into the pale morning light with the weight of the island's survival on their wings. What followed was brutal. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, flying the swift and deadly Zero, tore through the American formations. Bombers fell in flames. Fighters spiraled into the sea. Those who survived often did so by miracle alone. And yet, despite the losses, the attack had accomplished one essential thing. It forced Japan's carriers to maneuver defensively, disrupted their launch schedules, and bought precious minutes for the American carriers, waiting far to the east. Meanwhile, aboard Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, the tension had reached a peak. At 7:02 a.m., acting on the intelligence that had guided every decision so far, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance issued one of the most consequential commands of the Battle of Midway. Launch everything. It was a gamble. The American aircraft would be flying at extreme range. Some might not have enough fuel to return, but if they reached the Japanese carriers before another strike could be launched, the balance of the Pacific War might shift in a single hour. The torpedo squadrons found the enemy first. VT-8 from Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, descended upon the Japanese Formation 15 slow, low-flying aircraft facing the full fury of the Zero fighters alone. One by one, they were shot down. VT-6 and VT-3 followed, suffering the same fate. Of the 41 men who flew those attacks, only one Ensign George Gay lived to see the water again. Tactically, the torpedo runs were a disaster. Strategically, they achieved the impossible. They drew every Japanese fighter down to sea level. At 10:22 a.m., the sky above the Japanese carriers was empty, and into that sky dropped 37 American dive bombers from Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, followed minutes later by bombers from Yorktown. McCluskey had found the carriers only by intuition, following the lone wake of a destroyer racing to rejoin the fleet. It was a sliver of luck at the edge of a cliff. The Japanese decks were chaos aircraft, rearmed and refueled, fuel hoses snaking across the planks, bombs stacked and unsecured. For a carrier, it was the most vulnerable moment imaginable. The dive bombers fell like thunder. Kaga was hit first, one bomb after another tearing through her hangars, igniting fuel and munitions. Akagi suffered a single devastating hit that triggered fires beyond control. Soryu was struck moments later, consumed by explosions that rolled through her decks. In less than 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 frontline carriers were mortally wounded. Only Hiru remained. She struck back with ferocity, crippling Yorktown in 2 separate attacks. But her triumph did not last. Late that afternoon, American bombers found her as well. 4 bombs ended her resistance. By sunset, the seas that had once carried Japan's naval supremacy now held the ruins of all 4 of her carriers. The Battle of Midway had become the turning point not because of strength, but because of insight. Not because of numbers, but because intelligence had placed the U.S. Navy exactly where it needed to be at the exact moment history demanded. In the hours after the guns fell silent, the scale of what had happened at Midway began to take shape not only in the wreckage drifting across the Pacific, but in the minds of the commanders who understood how wars truly turn. For the United States, the victory was more than naval triumph. It was a strategic rebalancing that reshaped the entire Pacific War. 4 elite Japanese carriers were gone, along with hundreds of irreplaceable pilots whose training had taken years. Japan's offensive momentum, the force that had swept across the Pacific from Hong Kong to the Solomons, had reached its high water mark. From Washington to London to Canberra, Allied leaders recognized the meaning immediately. The myth of Japanese invincibility had cracked. More importantly, the United States now held the initiative. No longer forced into a defensive crouch, the Navy could choose where and when to strike. Within months, American forces would land on Guadalcanal, beginning an island-hopping campaign made possible only because the Japanese carrier arm had been crippled at Midway. But the deeper shift came behind the scenes. In the world of World War II naval intelligence, what Joseph Rochefort and Station Hypo had proven was revolutionary. Intelligence could no longer be a slow, bureaucratic process filtered through distant offices. It had to be direct, actionable, and trusted by those making decisions at sea. Nimitz embraced this instinctively. Washington, slower and more cautious, eventually followed. Across the Pacific, Japanese leaders struggled to understand how the Americans had been waiting for them. They changed code books. They tightened procedures. They investigated their scout planes and wireless operators. Yet the truth that their encrypted communications had been compromised remained unthinkable within the Imperial Navy. And because they never solved the mystery, they sailed into future battles still unaware that American codebreakers were listening. For the United States, Midway's real legacy lay not only in the victory but in the validation it gave to intelligence itself. The ability to read an enemy's intentions, to anticipate moves before they unfolded, became a foundation of modern naval warfare. It guided operations from the Solomon Islands to the Marianas. It enabled the mission that brought down Admiral Yamamoto's aircraft in 1943. A strike planned with the same confidence that had shaped the ambush at Midway. The world saw the carriers burn. What it did not see was the quiet, disciplined reasoning that had placed American forces in the right place at the right hour, proof that wars are shaped not only by courage and firepower, but by the minds working in the shadows. In the decades after the battle, the Pacific Ocean softened, the warships rusted away, and new generations grew up never knowing how close the world had come to a very different future. Yet the legacy of Midway endured not only in the victory itself, but in the quiet, almost invisible work that had made it possible. And at the center of that legacy stood a man who never asked for recognition and never received it in his lifetime. Joseph Rochefort returned to ordinary duty after the battle, stripped of authority, reassigned to administrative work far from the cold basement where Station Hypo had changed the course of the Pacific War. Official reports minimized his contributions. Awards were denied. Bureaucrats who had doubted him worked tirelessly to erase him from the story. To the public, he became a footnote. To the Navy, an uncomfortable reminder of how institutions can fail the people who saved them. But those who had been there, the pilots who dove into fire, the sailors who lived because the carriers were waiting in the right place, the intelligence officers who learned from his methods, they remembered. They carried his name into hearings, into books, into the quiet halls of military history. Slowly, the record began to correct itself. 43 years after Nimitz first recommended him for a medal, the nation finally honored Rochefort with the Distinguished Service Medal. A year later came the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And eventually, the building that rose on the site of his old basement bore his name. It was late, it was imperfect, but it was truth. Midway's broader lesson reaches far beyond the war that shaped it. It reminds us that victories are often built on unnoticed labor, on minds willing to challenge convention, on individuals who accept isolation in exchange for clarity. It reminds us that intelligence, quiet, patient, relentless, can be as decisive as any fleet. And it asks us something still relevant today. How many turning points in history begin with people whose stories we almost never hear? If this journey through the Battle of Midway, World War II, naval intelligence, and the extraordinary life of Joseph Rochefort has resonated with you, consider joining our community. Share the lessons you take from this story. Tell us what part of the Pacific War still lingers in your thoughts. And if you wish to keep exploring the hidden moments that shaped our world, we invite you to subscribe and stay with us for the next chapter. Some victories echo loudly. Others live in the quiet spaces where history is written by those who simply refuse to look away.